can't not have a question. Anyway, moving on. So let's get started with this lecture. So first thing first I want to talk about is GMP. We kind of hit on this a few times now, just mentioned it here and there, but formally GMP, if you guys don't know already, it's good manufacturing practices, right? Essentially, you're following a set of rules and regulations set forth, in our case by the FDA, that certain things have to be manufactured, meeting certain quality aspects, right? In terms of GMP, you can really, not GMP, but GXP is the formal way of saying good blank practices of anything. If you do work in a lab, one of the common ones you hear is what's GLP, which is good laboratory practice. Some things related to good laboratory practice would be like preventing cross-contamination, using positive and negative controls, things like that. So basically you're doing a good job in the setting that we were talking about. So if we're talking about manufacturing, you have good processes related to manufacturing. If you're working in a lab, you have good processes or practices related to a lab, right? Now with GMP, specifically for manufacturing, in our case, there are FDA regulations, like I said. If a company is found not to find the regulations, a company can be shut down, right? As much as it is important in the research and development of your product and showing that it doesn't have any sort of side effects and things, it's equally as important that you manufacture your product to a certain set code such that we can be sure that, all right, you prove your drug works. Now you got to make sure that you're preventing any sort of other issues related to the manufacturing process of that drug, right? So let's just say there was no issues with, it's like a kidney failure, for example, and all of a sudden when you start actually mass producing this thing, now you're starting to see, kidney failure in your patients when they take this drug. Well, one of the things that the FDA and the company itself would hone in on is the manufacturing process. Is there something that's being introduced to this drug that wasn't previously there, right? So that's why the GMP is very, very important, right? Now, you want to make sure that the regulations that are set by the FDA, they are essentially for most settings, right? So it's not necessarily to say that we have the best manufacturing processes. You want to create a good manufacturing process such that most companies can follow this set of rules, right? It can lead down different roads, right? Maybe one company is going to say, hey, you know what, we want to do, 3 sets of controls. We're going to sample, 4 or 5 different samples from every single batch, and that's the way we're going to maintain our manufacturing process. Another company might say, you know what, we only need 1 control and we only need to test 1 sample per batch, right? So it varies, but the idea is that here's the best practices, or here's like good practices, not necessarily the best practices, right? A company can improve on it if they so please, but good manufacturing process, the regulations for GMP, is the most basic form that every company has to meet, right? That's kind of like the bar. If you go above it, great. If you go under it, not so great, right? Let's see. So here's an example of the actual regulations for good manufacturing practices. So for example, these are all still found in the Code of Federal Regulations Title 21. But depending on the product you're making, right, you have a different set of regulations, right? So, CFR Part 210, right? Realize that it's in Part 200 or Series 200, that's going to be related to the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, right? So now here we have current good manufacturing practices in processing and packing holding of drugs, right? So this part of the regulation is going to tell you about how you're going to manufacture it, what's a good process to manufacture it, what's the best way to process it, packing it, and in the case of, if you need to store it, how can you actually hold it? Does it have to be cold? Does it have to be room temperature? Is there a certain humidity requirement? All those things will be outlined there, right? We can look at 21 CFR Part 606, right? So now this is like the 600 series. You should now start to realize that, what series are we talking about and what does it relate to? In this case, 600 is going to talk about like the biologics, right? So good manufacturing practices for blood and blood components, right? So anything related to blood, how can we manufacture those things, right? All of this is in Title 21 of CFR. Hopefully you don't have any questions. Normally it's where I ask a question, but you can. Hopefully you don't. Moving forward, a QMS system, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but essentially a QMS system, what it means, it's a quality management system, right? Essentially what it is a system of steps that a company will create, and you're basically trying to make sure that you're meeting regulatory compliance, right? So if the regulation says you need to have a minimum of one positive control, one negative control, and you need to test at least one sample per batch. Well, how do you actually go about making sure that's being done? Right? This is where the QMS system would come in. So you would have, for example, one of the things that might be part of it might be a report, like a final report per batch that says positive control included, and a tech would sign off on it. Negative control included, a tech would sign off on it. Was one sample tested per batch, as someone would sign off on it. And that basically ensures that the regulations were met. This is a person that's saying the regulations were met, and then you can keep that documentation, right? Now, with a QMS system, right, this is mandatory. It has to be created by the. It's something that has to be created by the company, specific for the company, and it's mandated by the FDA, right? It's a good thing because it forces every company to have some sort of quality managing system, right? It's not just like here's the regulations and everyone does their own thing trying to meet those regulations, right? It's kind of makes things more uniform across the board. That's why it's a lot easier when you go from one company to another company to another company. If you work in an industry, more or less things are very simple, and similar rather, not simple, but similar, and you might have one or two things different from company to company, but for the most part, the quality management system from one company to the next is gonna be, um, you know, pretty much the same thing, right? Now, the whole point of the quality management system is to just make sure that you're meeting the requirements for the product, right? So, not only achieving a good quality product, but making sure that you're meeting all of the customer requirements, right? Are you making the product the way it should be done? Are you making sure that there's no, faulty inner processes inside that product? If you're talking about like a medical device, making sure like a heart valve works the way it should. This is all something that has to be encompassed by the quality management system, right? Now, with respect to a QMS, when I say QMS, it is not any one tangible thing, right? It's not something that you a company has and it's like, oh, this is our QMS system. You sign in, log in, and you start signing off on paperwork. It does not work that way, right? A quality management system is multiple steps, multiple departments that are playing together to make an overarching QMS system. So you might have a quality department, you might have a manufacturing department, right? Both those departments will have a set of rules on how paperwork is done, the set of tolerances for certain devices or pharmaceutical drugs and things like that, and it's all under the one umbrella of the QMS. So manufacturing department might be reporting to the quality department saying, we ran these tests, we found one batch was contaminated. Then it's the quality department that's going to jump in and say, all right, we're holding that batch, and the quality department might tell upper level management saying, hey, we got this batch, what do you want to do with it? All right, do we need to notify the FDA? Do we need to notify our customers? Is this potentially like a lethal thing? Right, so it's not just one thing where you just sign into a computer, right? It's multifaceted system, right? Now, this is kind of like an example. It's like very rudimentary, but it is, basically how, like, essentially how a quality management system would work. So the idea of quality management system is that you're continuously improving on the quality of your product, right? Essentially, you have on the left hand side you have customer requirements, and on the right hand side you have customer satisfaction, right? So management's responsibility is basically to listen to the customer's requirements, right? Manage the resources necessary to make those requirements happen. Start producing the product, right? And then you start having, and then you start pushing that product out. Once you start pushing that product out, you're going to have customers giving you feedback, right? Now, either they're going to say it's great, or it's terrible, or people are dying, or whatever it is. And essentially, what you're doing is in this QMS system is you're going to start measuring and analyzing what the data is telling you, right? Now, the data could be, if it's great, then you necessarily don't have many things to do, right? If you're producing the product as advertised and it's effective the way you expected it to be, there's not a lot to do. However, more often than not, there's going to be some degree of input from customer satisfaction, right? Maybe it's not even the product itself. Maybe it's your packaging, right? Maybe the packaging is really poor. Maybe it's really hard to get into. Maybe it's that really, really terrible plastic that we all like cut our fingers on, right? It's like we don't want that. So that's something that the company would want to consider. And so once they get that feedback, then it's going to go back into the management and the quality management system as a whole, and everyone's going to analyze this, right? They're going to say, okay, well, you know what, that plastic is really terrible. We need to change it. Then they're going to go in, change it, so on and so forth, and it continues, right? So the new plastic will come out, and we're going to say, oh yes, the plastic is great, or the plastic's even worse than before, and then they're going to go back and readjust, so on and so forth. So essentially, the QMS system, you have management, you have like the manufacturing side, and then you have like the quality side. All of them working in conjunction to make sure that the customer is happy, right? Um, Now with the QMS, one of the interesting things is that you have not like two or three subsystems, you have multiple subsystems, right? First and foremost, you have like design controls, right? What are the controls used during the design process of the thing? The next is one of the most important things is document control, right? Who is signing off on what documents? What documents do we need signed off? What things do we need to maintain constantly? This is by far one of the most important things, because if the FDA comes and knocks on your door and they say, you know what, you released a faulty product and you knew about this, this is where you can whip out the report saying, hey, you know what, we checked it. Here's a report from that date, from that batch, and it shows that it passed all our quality metrics. So we don't know what's happening beyond. Maybe someone's faking it. Maybe someone's just trying to sue you, right? Things like that. Another really important aspect of it is the training aspect. So training, this kind of go into training your employees, making sure that your employees are trained properly on all the equipment, making sure trainees know that what positive controls, what negative controls are necessary to use, what a good quality test looks like, what a bad test looks like. They should know what a device looks like when it fails. They should know what a pharmaceutical drug looks like when it fails, right? And that's all part of training. Then you have risk management, right? So it's like, what are the potential hazards or possibilities of things going wrong? That's something that should be assessed beforehand. You don't want to start producing a product and have no idea of all the possible things that could go wrong. Yes, there's always something that comes up that you never really thought about, but for the most part, you can think of things like that potentially might go wrong ahead of time. So if you think about those ahead of time, you can also start preventing them ahead of time, right? So you kind of prevent costs of things after it's left your factory, right? Audits are important in the sense that the FDA comes in and makes sure you're doing things properly. Supplier management is, I think, one of the other really big points, because you're going to be getting raw product and raw materials from different sources, right? Unless you're making everything in-house, which chances are you're not, because you're going to be ordering chemicals or if you're making medical devices, you're going to be ordering metals and plastics and things like that. It's really important to make sure you have a steady supply and a good supply and a person that you can constantly rely on, right? If you have a supplier, you know, who's producing the plastic for your artificial heart valve, and their tolerances for failure are much greater than what you'd want. That's not someone you'd want to buy your plastic from, right? You want to buy plastic from someone that has really good quality plastic consistently, so that way you can rule out any sort of defects just because of your supply chain, right? So it's really, really important that your supply chain is in good hands. Non-conformance handling. So basically, this is where if anything goes wrong, how do we handle that, right? What's going to happen? Do we need to, burn the whole batch? Is this a issue that we need to tell the FDA? Again, do we need to tell our customers? That's where non-conformance goes into. Corrective and preventative actions. So, um, preventative actions are proactive. So essentially, this is where not necessarily always proactive. So let me take that back. So corrective and preventative. Essentially, what happens is with these actions is something went wrong, right? Um, let's just say with the heart valve, you know, um, you're producing it from plastic. The plastic was heated too hot, right? And therefore the plastic was, what would you say? The plastic is not of good quality, or it's compromised. That's the word. So the plastic was compromised, and your quality test didn't pick up on it. You sent it out, and then a lot of patients had issues with this heart valve because the plastic had gone bad. Right. Eventually, you figure it out that the plastic was overheated. Right. So now you got to figure out, one of the things you're going to do is, how do you correct this action, right, or prevent this action in the future. So if it's correctable, you do what's called a corrective action. So, in the case of the heart valve, there's nothing you can really do, right? It's already been put in a person's heart. You can't really fix it and take it back, right? If it was for example, like a genetic test, one of the things you can do is you can do a corrective action where you can change like the mutation call, and then you can call your patient and let them know, hey, you know what, we accidentally actually we had the wrong mutation. You actually don't have the mutation, so you've corrected it in the eyes of the patient. The next thing you want to do is you're going to do what's called a preventative action. So the preventative action is, how are you going to prevent this mistake from happening again, right? So if you overheated that plastic and that's what caused the problem, right? How are you going to prevent that overheating from happening again, right? One of the things you might do is maybe you set a limiter on like a machine that's heating the plastic. So if it's not supposed to go over 100 degrees Celsius, you set a limit saying, you know what, 100 degrees Celsius is the maximum. Any sort of personnel cannot go any higher than that. So it prevents it from being overheated in the future, so you don't have that same error, right? Another subsystem would be the complaint handling. So that's something that we all do when things don't work the way they're supposed to, right? We call in, we say, "Hey, your product sucks. I want my money back," etc., etc. Right? That's one aspect of it, is how you handle the customer complaint and how you offer the refund or whatever it may be. But the other aspect of the complaint handling is how you push it forward to the rest of the company, right? So if there's a certain aspect of this product that's being complained about a lot, you want your quality department and maybe your research and development department to know, hey, there's this one thing that everyone's complaining about. Maybe you should fix it, right? That's something that comes back into the customer satisfaction, right? So if they're constantly complaining about the one product or the one thing, you want your management to know so they can fix this, right? So once you fix it, then you can, you send out your new part two, right? And lastly, you have what's called a quality manual. Basically, the quality manual has everything that's related to quality inside the company, right? How is your quality going to be managed? Now, with respect to the QMS system, so you can see here with the FDA, it is required using the code of the USC Law 21 and then the Code of Federal Regulations Title 21 require that you have a quality management system, right? At the same time, we're going to talk about ISO in a minute. ISO also requires that each company have a quality management system. So it's one of those things that if you're producing, these biological products for use in people, you need to have this. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? Now, the degree of which you have it, that varies from company to company, but you need to have a quality management system, right? Now, we've kind of been talking about quality for a little bit now, but I guess the one thing I want to hit on before we move forward with respect to ISO and everything is essentially what is quality, right? We kind of talked about it. Some people said quality was meeting customer expectations. Other people said quality is beating other competitors, making a better product than the other person, right? Now, the thing with quality is it's one of the definitions that kind of varies from person to person, right? It's very, very subjective, right? To me, a quality product is something that works every single time without any sort of issues. To another person, it might be a product that works every single time better than the competitor, right? So quality is something that kind of varies from person to person, right? But in the end, essentially, the idea is the same in that you're saying that quality is meeting or satisfying some sort of standard, right? Whether that is a FDA standard, whether that's the customer standard, whether that's the industry standard, you're meeting some sort of goal, right? And in the end, your whole idea is to just make the customer happy with that product. And one of the things I kind of like to talk about is toasters, right? It's like the basic, really simple thing. Everyone knows what a toaster is. If you don't, it's that thing that toasts your bread in the morning, right? Now, what types of things do you expect from a toaster, right? Some people have like those super fancy toasters that put smiley faces into their bread, and that's what they expect out of their toaster, right? Other people, for the most part, just expect that it toasts your bread well, right? Like it gets you to the right level of crunchiness that you're happy with it, and it's nice and warm. That's what a toaster is, right? So it really, really depends on the customer base and like what you're trying to do with your product, right? It can vary. Your quality can vary depending on like what standards you're trying to meet. Now with quality and like the regulations, essentially what the FDA is saying is that we want you to not only make a good, safe product, but it has to be an effective product. So we go back to the toaster. If you make a toaster and it doesn't really toast, right? Are you really happy with that? You wouldn't be, right? The same thing with the FDA. If you're making something, even though it might be harmless, you want to make sure that it does something. Otherwise, why would you want to put anything in your body otherwise, right? So you want to make sure that you're producing things that are effective. And that's what the FDA is trying to do. Is like they're trying to make sure that it's kind of like comes in consumer protection. Is that you're not buying bogus things, right? That's what's happening in like the early like 1800s, 1900s. Like people were producing these elixirs and stuff that are supposed to solve every single problem in the book, but they really actually, either they did really bad things or they really didn't do what you expected them to do, right? So the FDA is here and they're saying that it's not only good enough that you make a safe product, it has to be something that's effective. You're doing what your product says it's supposed to do, right? Now, with maintaining their quality, companies can set up their quality departments in a few different ways, right? You can have one single quality department, and that's kind of the way most companies do it. You have a single department where all the personnel are carrying out both quality assurance and quality control all at the same time, right? There's other companies out there that have two different departments, right? They have a quality assurance department and a quality control department. We'll talk about the difference in a second, right? Or you can also have the quality control department within the quality assurance department. But for the most part, most people have one single quality department because, if you think about it, it just makes communication that much easier. Everyone's under one umbrella. You're taking care of everything in one spot. It's easier to talk to each other. It's easier to make sure, when bad things happen, you resolve the problem quickly, right? Versus people emailing each other, like calling each other back and forth, trying to make something happen, right? Um, but the whole idea here is you will have a quality control and a quality assurance in one shape or form. Now, what is a quality assurance and quality control department, right? Quality assurance is the department where everything is done proactively, right? Let me say that again. Quality assurance is the department or the segment of the company where everything is proactive, right? So essentially, your whole goal here is to prevent the bad stuff from happening, right? We had the scenario with the plastic being overheated, right? The quality assurance department is there because they're going to make sure that they know that's a potential hazard. They're going to prevent that thing from happening, right? So that plastic never gets overheated, the heart valves never get sent out, and patients' hearts don't fail, right? That's the whole point of quality assurance. Quality control is typically reactive, right? That means things go bad. How do we correct it, and how do we make it right? Right? So this is where essentially you wouldn't necessarily say it's a failure on the part of quality assurance, um, but in a way it is. But there's always things that are unforeseen that can happen, and that's what the QC department's for, right? It's to check everything, like all the batches before it's sent out. No, not before, but rather to check the batches after they're sent out to make sure that everything is in working order. And if there is something that was not working properly, well, okay, how do we make that right? Right there. So this is where you start writing those corrective actions and preventative actions, the QC department. So plastic overheated. This is our corrective action. If there is one, this is how we prevent it in the future. That would be your preventative action, right? And so that would be then given to the quality assurance department so they know, this thing happened. Please prevent this from happening any time in the future, right? So they're in constant communication. So this is why it makes sense. You have one quality department, everyone's in the same umbrella, they can talk to each other quickly. So quality control catches something, all right, tell the quality assurance people, this is what happened, make sure it doesn't happen again. They're on the lookout for it. Now, in essence, you should have solved the problem. It should not happen again, right? We kind of hit on these before with the cost of quality. There's a few different costs of quality. First and foremost, there's the prevention costs. So essentially, what you're doing with prevention costs is you're making sure you're trying to prevent anything bad from happening from the beginning, right? So this is where you have your tolerances, you have your specifications. This is where you have the documents for your employees to follow, right? Um, this is going to be essentially your cheapest measure in terms of a quality department, right? Because this doesn't cost as much as the other things will. Appraisal costs are going to be the costs related to measuring and monitoring your quality. So this is essentially how much it costs to run your quality assurance and quality control departments, right? Again, necessary, not as expensive as one of the last things we're going to talk about, which is like the external failure costs, right? So with your appraisal cost, this is basically where you're doing your testing. This is where you're doing your sampling. This is making sure that your batches are performing as they should. And then last but not least, we have internal and external failures. Remember, we talked about this. So internal failure is something is the cost of something failing inside your company and you catch it, right? That way, you prevent the product from going out. Customers never see it. It doesn't really harm your company as bad. Yes, you'll have some product that you have to destroy or whatever and get rid of, and you lose some money there. But it's not as bad as sending it out and people getting sick or potentially dying. Um, Lastly, you have the external failure costs. So the external failure cost is essentially this is where you release the product for whatever reason your quality department did not catch it. Um, the a bad batch went out. Maybe the sample you tested didn't pick it up. Maybe it did, and you still released it. It could be a number of things. But this is going to be the most expensive thing there is, because you released it out to the public. First and foremost, it's going to ruin your reputation as a company for releasing a product that wasn't of the right quality, right? It's not easy to trust, right? Trust is one of those things you have to build, and if you lose it, especially in that industry, you lose it for good, because chances are there's another person out there that is doing the same thing, and now they're going to get the customers, right? The next thing is the money, right? It's going to cost you a lot of money to correct any sort of failure on your part, right? Now, especially because we're talking about biosciences, right, and biotech, these are things that could potentially harm a person and potentially kill them. Who do you think they're going to sue after they find out it came from your company, right? This can cost you big money, and especially in the lost revenue from customers going to other places, right? So it's better to spend the money on your prevention costs, appraisal costs, beforehand, so that way you catch anything before it leaves your factory, or your lab, and then you write it off as your internal failures, right? Much cheaper than ever releasing anything. So it's always better to make a solid quality department, invest the money in it. That way, because you can lose it all in quality. That's the idea, right? If everything, you can have the world's most amazing product, but if the quality is terrible and you have a track record for producing bad product, no one's gonna buy it, right? So companies should, buy spend money into their quality department. Now, one of the things that you probably will understand is that, there's the idea of quality and you need continuous improvement. Essentially, the idea of continuous improvement is literally the definition. You need to continuously improve your quality. One of the classic ways you do this is what's called the PDCA cycle, right? The PDCA cycle is like the plan, do, check, act cycle. The idea is, if there's some sort of, improvement that's needed, let's just say you found out that, one of your machines wasn't working the way it should, or you know there's some problem with lab personnel training, right? You're going to follow this PDCA cycle. So essentially, the first thing you're doing, you're going to plan. That's the first part. What do you want to do? What do you need to change? So if your problem is with the lab personnel, maybe you're going to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to train these people. I'm going to train my personnel, one time a month for 3 hours, right? And that's going to help your quality, right? Then what you do, literally, is do what you planned, right? So if your idea was to train them more, start training them more, right? And then what you're going to do is you're going to do what's essentially the check and the act come together, and that is you're going to check and see if it's actually working, right? If you're training your employees one time a month, making an improvement on your quality, or is it not, right? If there isn't, what do you need to change now? So you're going to act on it, and you're going to go back to the planning phase and change it if you need to, or if you don't need to, that's great. You just keep on doing what needs to be done, right? So just keep on training them every month, and you shouldn't have a problem, right? But essentially, you keep on repeating this cycle of PDCA, plan, do, check, act, over and over again until you have the amount of quality that you want, right? Or an instance of just constantly maintaining good quality. Now, if you're meeting your regulations with quality, and GMP, you shouldn't have a problem, right? FDA is not really going to say anything. They're going to check on you, and they're going to just make sure your T's are crossed, your I's are dotted, and you're on your merry way. If they find out that you're not doing things up to spec, meaning that you are non-compliant, you're not meeting regulations, what they will do is they'll sign off on what's called a 483 form. The 483 form is essentially a report that says this company has been notified that they are not, meeting regulations. You're not meeting the regulations in Title 201 of CFR 21. So this is essentially letting the company know that you guys are not doing what you're supposed to be doing. I would like to load this. Hopefully you can load it on your own. But essentially, what this link is it's a link to current 483 form notices. So you can actually go in and you can look at current non-compliance companies. Um, you can look for yourself and see if there's any themes or trends that you'll see. Like one of them, most common themes, is documentation. Right, a company doesn't have the documentation required. That means they're missing something. They're not storing it properly. Things are not dated. Things are not signed off. It could be any number of things. So one of the biggest things that you'll see with companies is that they're not meeting proper documentation, which falls under your QMS system, which falls under your Title 21 of the CFR. Right, so you're not meeting regulations because of your documentation. Um, Another common thing that you can see on there typically is like expired goods, um, false handling practices. So basically, you're not storing chemicals or things like that in the right places. If you have flammables, flammables are not in the flammable cabinets. If you have acids and bases, you're probably putting them together. Things of that nature, right? But I highly recommend you check this out. It's not working for me right now. But you guys, I'll post up the lecture and you guys can always copy and paste the link. Um, Now, this is kind of just an outline of potential actions that the FDA can take. Um, the whole idea is that I'll just give you a generalization. You guys can read through it on your own. Is that they can take either administrative actions or judicial actions. So administration actions, basically, the FDA has the right to either recall your product. They can remove people from your company. So, for example, if you have a quality person that outright was not maintaining regulations, they can remove them from your company. They can basically withdraw your product approval. So, saying, let's just say you have a drug out there, um, it works great, but you're not packaging it properly. They can remove that from the shelf, right? So they can actually directly affect your company on the spot. Other things they can do is judicial actions, right? So essentially, judicial actions are judicial meaning the law. Most commonly, you can have what's called like your criminal prosecutions or penalties or fines to have to pay, right? So if you're actually doing things that are so terrible that people are getting sick and dying, and you knew about this, you could go to jail, and the FDA will make sure you go to jail, right? Um, that's essentially murder, right? If you knew that your product, you weren't meeting standards, you were not meeting regulations, because you're not meeting these regulations, you knew that people could die. That's you know, that's you're killing people. So FDA will go ahead and actually carry out judicial actions in that sense. So making sure that you are complying with good manufacturing practices, also complying with the quality management system regulations is extremely, extremely important. It's only one aspect of the total 21 CFR, but I feel like it's also one of the most important aspects of 21 CFR. 21 CFR also talks about all your like production habits and chemicals and things like that you can use, but in itself, I think this is probably one of the most important sections of each series um, of 21 CFR. Now, kind of changing gears, so we're gonna talk about ISO and dang it, Adobe. So ISO, it stands for the International Organization of Standardization, but it is not spelled iOS. They do ISO because it's named after the Greek term isis, which essentially means equal. So all things are equal. Now, what ISO is basically it's an independent organization. So it's non-governmental, meaning that there is no government entities that control ISO. Right? ISO is essentially scientists and engineers from all around the world that have come together to make this one organization, and they set standards for each industry. Right? So scientists will set the standards for the sciences, engineers will set standards for like manufacturing or electrical engineering or computer engineering or whatever it may be, right? But the whole point is that governments have no say in this, right? ISO you can find almost all over the world. It's you can see right here. It's in over 166 countries, right? That's a lot of countries. That's why it's one of the most sought after things to be ISO certified, right? Now, the whole idea of ISO is to make sure standards across fields are all the same, right? So everyone in the science industry, all across the world, meets one certain set of standards, right? Because each country can make laws, right? We have, Title 21 CFR here in the U.S. In Europe, it might be different. In Africa, it might be different. Asia might be different. Middle East, it might be different, right? Everyone would have their own different sets of regulations. Now, what do you think would happen, right? Some countries would have stricter laws, while others would be more laxed, right? Now, how would the countries that are more strict know if the products coming from more lax companies are any good, right? For example, let's just say India has no real laws on good manufacturing practices. Well, if we're importing things from India into the United States, how could you know consumers know that that product is good? This is where ISO comes in, right? So if you are ISO certified, essentially the person knows that hey, they've met this set of standards, which is a pretty high set of standards to meet, mind you. Um, so this is where ISO jumps in, right? So we have FDA over here with the USC, so US codes, and then we have CFR. This is all governmental, right? The government's handling this. Even though the FDA is independent, it's still federal, right? On this side, we have ISO. ISO has no government ties. They have their own set of standards. They are um, as good, if not more strict, than the FDA at some points. FDA might be stricter in other points, but they have their own set of standards and they're independent from each other. And the company, if you really want to do a great job and have a good quality system and really sell your product anywhere in the world, you're going to have both, right? Especially in the US. You're going to have your FDA regulations met, you're going to have your ISO certification, then you can sell basically anywhere in the world and everyone will know the product you're producing is of good quality, right? Um, now, with ISO, essentially what you have is there's standards that are created specifically for manufacturing and technology. Um, the way they label their standards is similar to this. So basically, it's ISO 9000, ISO 14001. Um, this is the naming technique, and the whole idea here is you're producing things to a set standard across the globe, right? Um, Now, depending on what you're producing, you're gonna have different standards to meet. ISO is not a over-encompassing thing, right? Like 21 CFR has different sections. ISO also has different standards, right? If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, you're gonna have a different set of standards. If you are a part of the manufacturing industry, you're gonna have a different set of standards. Um, but the whole idea is to make it unanimously one set of standards for everyone to follow in that one area, right? Um, Now, who makes these ISO standards? Like, who's responsible? Like, is it just some Joe Blow? Like, can I be on the ISO community? No, you cannot, right? Essentially, what the ISO committees are is they're going to be professionals in the field, and they're going to come from all over the globe, right? The reason you want that is because you want input from everyone from each and every country to make sure that the process is unbiased as possible, right? Um, you know, if you have someone on the committee that's in favor of low standards and that's the only person on the committee, then everything's going to have pretty low standards, right? And that's not necessarily going to be the case if we want to bring that product into the United States. You want someone that, in our case, that we have pretty high standards, right? So it's important to have people from all over the globe, and it's important to have people from multiple industries, right? So, for the sciences, most of it's going to be scientists, but you're also going to throw in engineers and things like that in there just for some of the technical parts. Now, when you actually go and make this standard, there's four essential principles that they think about. The first is response to market need, right? What is the market looking for in terms of the product or the process that is being considered, right? Um, they'll look at the pharmaceutical industry, they'll look at the devices industry and see what the need is in those industries individually, right? Um, this comes into the technical committees, the second part, so based on global expert opinion. So this is where your panel is going to come in on from people all over the world that are experts in those fields, right? They're not just random people thrown in there. These are people that know a lot about pharmaceuticals. These are a lot of people. These are people that know a lot about medical devices if they're producing medical devices, right? Um, just not random people, right? Um, the next thing is really, really important. They use what's called a multi-stakeholder process. So essentially, you're going to have a lot of these professionals, a lot of these people that are giving their opinion are also going to be some people that work for companies, right? So you want people from multiple companies to be a part of this committee, right? If you only have one company that's being representative, what do you think is going to happen? They're all going to favor that one company, right? You don't want that. You want the whole idea of ISO is to not only make a uniform set of standards all across the world, but also kind of make an even playing field as well, right? So they're going to take people from multiple companies, multiple organizations, bring them together, and come up with one cohesive set of rules or standards, right? Again, it's just to make sure that there's not one, it's being fair to everyone, right? So not just the multi-billion-dollar company, it should also be the startup that has a shot too, right? Because if only multi-billion-dollar companies are represented, then what is this the startup that's worth nothing going to do, right? And then lastly, it's based on consensus, which means it's not always going to be 100% people agree with the set of standards. It's going to be when the majority of the most people agree with the standard when the standard is passed. Um, Now, a few of the standards that I would like you to know are these three right here. So there's ISO 9000, 2005. So this is basically a quality management system. So this is basically the basic idea of what a quality management system should be. Then you have ISO 9001, which is a quality management system and its requirements. So the first section was just telling you what the fundamentals of a quality management system is, like what types of like things it should have, the basic idea of what a quality management system is. This one's actually telling you the requirements for a quality management system. Then you have ISO 9004, part 2009, and this is what's managing for sustained success of an organization. So this is part of how you constantly improve your quality, right? So continuous improvement cycle. Um, Essentially, the whole ISO 9000 series is to tell you how to make a good quality management system, right? Now, the idea is if you meet all these requirements, so all the ISO 9000 requirements, you get what's called the ISO certification, right? Essentially, what you do is you will be applying for certification, um, and what it is a third party company will come by and they will check to see if you're actually meeting ISO standards. If you're meeting ISO standards, right, you get what's going to be called the certificate, ISO certification. So essentially, you get to put this on all your products. You get to say in a little corner on the back of your packaging, you can say ISO 9001 certified, which tells everyone out there that you are certified in the quality management system. that you're meeting the very, very high expectations of ISO with respect to your quality, right? So that's essentially, it's another saying, this is a good quality product based on expert opinion and the people that actually made up those rules, right? It is not easy to get ISO certification. ISO certification is very hard, but it is very, very much worth getting, right? Um, Once you have um, your ISO certification, or is it? I'll talk about it in a second. Let's talk about how you actually can do this. So essentially, what you're going to do, you need to have. So let's just say you're starting your company. You need to have a QMS system set up. You want to include all the different parts of your quality management system. So remember, we're talking about all the subset parts. So your documentation, your training, um, all the cost analysis and everything. Once you have that set up, then what you have is the third party company that comes in and audits you, right? Um, and they're going to see if you actually meet the standards. If you meet the standards, then you get your ISO 9000 certification. Now, this certification, I literally cannot tell you enough how amazing it is to have the ISO certification. It puts you on the board in the world, right? Because it's telling someone, if you're a small little startup in, let's say like, China, right? If you have ISO 9000 certification, essentially what's telling you, every other person in the world, that this product meets those qualifications, right? That is extremely, extremely valuable, right? Because to get that certification, it requires a lot of work to produce a good quality management system. And the fact that you produce that and you got the certification shows all your consumers that, right? That this company cared enough to produce a really good quality management system, such that they care about the quality of the product and I should be buying it. That's why I will buy from you, right? And this isn't just in terms of like consumer products that we buy, like drugs and medical devices. This could be anything, right? It could just be the plastic that medical device companies buy, right? If I am ISO certified in production of this plastic for medical devices, companies will come to me and say, you know what, you're ISO certified. I can trust the fact that you're going to produce a constant plastic and produce it well, right? Remember when comes, we were talking about supply chain. This will come into the supply chain aspect, so they can know that hey, this person produces product consistently because they're ISO 9000 certified. We can trust it. We're always going to buy our plastic from this company, right? It's important, right? Um, and furthering that point is there are some companies out there that only will work with ISO certified companies, right? Which makes sense. Like if I'm trying to produce the best product, I also want companies that want to produce their best product. So cohesively, we produce the best product. I'm not going to be trying to produce the best product and working with some Joe Blow that doesn't even really care about what they're producing, right? I want to work with the best, and the best in the world are people that's ISO certified, right? Um, One of the really unique things is that ISO certification, you need to reapply for it every 3 years. That means you're getting audited every 3 years. This is where you got to show them your last 3 years of work, all your documents for like the last 3 years, all your training for the last 3 years, all your batch records for the last 3 years, and show them that you're doing the job consistently. If you're getting recertified, that's a good sign that you're doing the things that you're supposed to, and companies will continue to work with you, right? Um, there are, in terms of money, there are some fees associated to certifying, getting ISO certification. Bigger companies cost more because there's more things to certify, right? Smaller companies will cost less because there's not as much of a QMS system in place, right? And that will do it. If you guys do have any questions, please, please, please email me. Um, Again, there is a quiz that is due at the end of this week. And I believe that's it. And then I will see you guys on Monday in a week. And we'll have week 4. And we'll be done with the class. Time is flying by. Alright, guys. I hope you guys have a good day. And I will see you guys soon. Cheers.